Hello, this is the lecture video to accompany the reading assignment for Berkeley, which is section 6.3 of the textbook, beginning on page 323 of the PDF. And before I get into the textual analysis, I want to frame where Berkeley sits in relationship to some of the other philosophers that we've discussed. Now, we're obviously looking at Berkeley in the context of this learning module titled Empiricism. So he's an empiricist philosopher, but remember that lineage coming up to him. Up to this point, we have discussed Plato, we have discussed Descartes, we have discussed Aristotle, we have discussed Locke, and now we're having a discussion of Berkeley. And so you've been introduced to a lot of pertinent definitions. You know what rationalism is, you know what empiricism is. Those are epistemological theories. And you've also been introduced to the metaphysical theories of idealism, or sometimes called immaterialism, and materialism. And what you've seen up to this point is that there is this association. Philosophers who are rationalist in their epistemology have a tendency to be idealist in their ontology. And philosophers who are empiricist in their epistemology have a tendency to be materialist in their metaphysics. Berkeley is an interesting figure because he is an empiricist in his epistemology, but he is an idealist in terms of, or immaterialist in terms of his ontology. And Berkeley makes this argument that on empiricist grounds, contrary to what people like Aristotle and Locke have to say, on empiricist grounds, you actually can't make a claim of knowledge about a physical world that exists in the universe. On empiricist grounds, Berkeley says, that the only thing we can rightfully conclude exist are perceptions and ideas themselves, and perceptions and ideas are non-physical. Now, that's Berkeley's conclusion. What I'm going to be spending time explaining in the next probably 15 or so minutes is how Berkeley ends up, how Berkeley constructs an argument to justify that conclusion. And a lot of times there's a difficulty that students face in studying Berkeley, because what he's saying is so in contrast or in opposition to your intuitions about reality, that a lot of students just will discard, Berkeley just offhand and say, well, obviously physical things exist, and so we don't even need to take this guy seriously. That's a bad way of approaching this. What we're attempting to do, we're not attempting you to agree or disagree with his conclusion. What we're trying to do here is to get you to understand his argument that he gives in favor of that conclusion, and to support that conclusion, rather. And the challenge of Berkeley is that the way he develops his argument, each point of his argument doesn't really seem all that controversial. It's the conclusion that he draws which is controversial, and yet nothing he says in support of that conclusion seems objectionable in and of itself, and thus we seem committed to the truth of the conclusion that he draws. So with those points out of the way, let's get to the material from the text. So notice that just the title of section 6.3, reality depends on perception. There's this Latin phrase there that is introduced, and up to this point you've been introduced to a lot of Latin phrases. Of course, we've been emphasizing those Latin phrases a priori and a posteriori. Rationalist philosophers emphasize the a priori, Latin phrase that means prior to the event or prior to the case, prior to observation. And empiricist philosophers have a tendency to emphasize, emphasize the a posteriori. And what we mean by a posteriori is something which is after the event or after the case, after observation. So people like Descartes, Plato, they're the a priori approach. People like Aristotle, Locke, they're the a posteriori approach. And we also have seen several other Latin expressions. With Plato, with Descartes, you saw that Latin expression "cogito ergo sum." I think therefore I am. With John Locke, you saw that Latin expression "tabula rasa," which means blank slate. With Berkeley, we have this expression here, "esse est percipi," which means to be is to be perceived. And so that's what links us to the title of this section. Reality depends on perception. Remember Locke and his causal theory of perception. What Locke is going to say is that there's something physical, material, which is out there, which is causing this sensation that I'm having. What Berkeley says is that on empiricist grounds, we can't infer that there's something external, so that there's something exterior from the sensation that is the cause of it. And I want to go back and review a couple of things from the previous reading assignment, the reading assignment on Locke. In this blue highlighted passage here, this is a statement by John Chafee, and I brought the wrong reading glasses with me here, so I'm going to have to see if I can't make this text a little bit bigger. And for some reason, oh, there we go. Wasn't hitting it hard enough. So I want to go ahead and read this blue highlighted passage. The fact that his being John Locke's, this is John Chafee talking about John Locke. The fact is that his theory of causal perception has created an excruciating dilemma for him. If all knowledge comes from experience, that's John Locke's position as an empiricist, right? And if all we directly know are the mental impressions caused by sense data emitted by external objects, again, that's Locke's position. What Locke is going to say that what causes that there's a material object outside, external to us, which is causing a certain sensation. But the only thing we're in direct contact with is the perception. We're not in direct contact with the thing, the entity that is the source of that sensation. We are locked in a world of our own mental images with no access to whatever is responsible for producing these images. Locke suggests in some places that our mental impressions are copies of external events, resemblances, he calls them. So that's what Locke, what is referred to as Locke's representative theory of realism, or representative realism. What Locke is going to say is, well, yes, on empiricist grounds, the only thing that I actually have access to are my perceptions. But my perceptions are representative of a world that exists beyond me. And what Chafee is doing here is pointing out that we're not justified in making that claim. On empiricist grounds, the only thing that I can make a claim of knowledge is about that what I'm perceiving. But I'm not perceiving a material object. I'm perceiving a perception. The perception isn't out there, right? It's not in the universe. The perception, by definition, is subject to the act of perception. So continuing here, where did I leave off? But how can we ever be sure how accurate the copies are? We lack an external point of reference from which we can compare the objects and the copies. This green highlighted passage. Again, this is John Chafee talking about John Locke. Locke argues that the qualities we experience, both primary and secondary, must reside in something. So use the example of the cup. I think I was using my pineapple whip cup last time. I'm going to use my unicorn cup this time. Locke argues that the qualities we experience, both primary and secondary, must reside in something. Therefore, there must be some external substance which these qualities are a necessary part. So again, still reviewing Locke. What Locke is going to say is that this cup is a material thing inhabiting a material universe that is causing me to have a certain sensation. So whenever I look at this cup, I get this certain visual sensation of seafoam green and pink and white lettering and gold highlights around the mane of the unicorn. All of that is visual information that's being relayed to me from this material object. according to Locke. And some of those qualities are primary, some of them are secondary. So the color, the texture, the sound that it makes, all of those are secondary qualities. But those secondary qualities can only exist if there's something here to emit them. So what Locke calls extension, that this cup, it has numerical identity, it has extension, those are primary qualities. So because this cup exists, I can describe it as having a color. Because this cup exists, it has extension, I can describe it as having a texture, etc. But we have a problem here. But what are these substances that we can never directly experience actually like? So what Locke wants to say is that there is this material thing external to me, which is the source of all these sensations that I'm having. But I don't have access to the material thing. I only have access to the non-material thing, which is the sensation, which is the perception, which is the idea of the thing. Such substances, Locke says, we know not what. Very disappointing answer. We have no clear or distinct idea. So that's Locke's language, but he's importing some earlier vocabulary terms from Descartes. We have no clear or distinct idea. Nothing but the unknown support these qualities. And that's why Chaffee here, sort of in anticipation of what he's going to be talking about whenever he gets to his presentation of Berkeley, says that Locke's grand empiricist epistemology may have begun with a bang, but it surely ends with a whimper. And it's that whimper that we're pointing out with in our discussion of Berkeley. So all of that is just to talk about Berkeley's, this Latin expression here, esse est percipi, to be is to be perceived. Another terminology point here, subjective idealism, is the name that we give rather to Berkeley's theory, and that's in contrast to the objective idealism of Plato. Remember, Plato says that there are these forms which exist independently, right? They're just out there in this ethereal realm. That's Plato's objective idealism. The form of treeness has always existed and will always exist. It's not dependent on anything. Berkeley's idealism is different. Berkeley's idealism is subjective, meaning that it's subject to the act of perception, and that's tied in with this Latin expression esse est percipi. So these opening paragraphs here in this indented area, which is, we're talking about what Berkeley said directly. Berkeley is starting off with the strong statement of empiricism in this first numbered paragraph. He's saying that everything we know comes from our experiences. So that's his hard statement of empiricism. But whenever he gets to the second paragraph here, he starts to point out that, what sort of seems like a solid foundation on empiricism to make a claim about something that exists in the world, some physical thing that exists in the world, starts to weaken a little bit whenever you subject it to a high degree of scrutiny. And to that end, Berkeley makes a distinction between the perception and the perceiver, which we can compare to Descartes' distinction earlier between the thought and the thinker. So whenever Descartes said cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, he's making this distinction between a thought and a thinker. I obviously have thoughts, and those thoughts presuppose the existence of a thinker, right? There has to be a thinker first before you can have a thought. So the existence of a thought presupposes the existence of a thinker. That's Descartes. Berkeley invokes a similar style of reasoning, but he uses that style of reasoning using this vocabulary of perceiver and perception. Clearly, I'm having perceptions, right? I have a perception. You have a perception of a cup. But a perception cannot exist in an unperceived state. How could it, right? A perception has to be perceived. And so, on the basis of a perception, we can conclude the existence of a perceiver. I can't perceive the existence of a physical cup, but I can perceive the existence of a perceiving entity, right? Because it's presupposed by it. And I skipped over this red parenthetical marginal note, rather, that I wrote. For Berkeley, our knowledge of an object, say an apple, that's the example that the author of your textbook uses, comes from the senses. He's an empiricist, after all, so that's no surprise. What is a surprise, though, is what Berkeley concludes about the metaphysical question of what the apple is. So, because I don't have an apple in my hand, I'm going to use the cup instead. So I certainly have a perception of the mug. You have a perception of the mug. But the metaphysical question is, what is the mug? What is the reality of the mug? And Berkeley gives us a particular kind of argument here. It's called the argument from abstraction, where Berkeley is going to ask you to sort of abstract away all the qualities, take away all the perceptual elements of the mug. So I'm going to sort of remove the color of the mug, and I'm going to remove the texture of the mug, and I'm going to remove the way the sound that the sound that the mug makes. I'm going to remove all of those things that I'm perceiving that are the reason why I say there is a mug. And what Berkeley points out is at the end of that process, once I take away all of the perceptual elements of the mug, it's not as if I'm left with a real mug in my hand. I'm left with no mug in my hand, right? So whenever I say there is a mug, what I really mean is I'm having a certain set of perceptions. The mug just is a set of perceptions. And remember, the perceptions aren't out there. The perceptions reside in the perceiving entity. Okay, so I'm going to leave some of the exposition here to the external resources that are embedded in the lesson module, because again, I've been going for about 17 or so minutes, and I don't want to try people's attention spans. And also, it's helpful to hear this in some voice other than my own. That way you don't have to hear me stutter and stammer my way through this material. Let's see, so paragraph 8 is a challenge to Locke's representational realism, so pay attention to that. That's an important paragraph. And the last thing I'll point out here is that the author of your textbook is a little bit unfair to Berkeley whenever he presents this information. He, in this blue highlighted passage here, he says, having consistently maintained his subjective idealism up until this point, Berkeley finally capitulates to the conventional thought, bringing in God as a vehicle for ensuring the existence of the external world. And then he gives this, he quotes this limerick from Ronald Knox: there once was a man who said God, who must find it exceedingly odd. There once was a man who said God must find it exceedingly odd if he finds that the tree continues to be when there's no one about in the quad. Dear sir, your astonishment's odd. I am always about in the quad, and that's why the tree continues to be, since observed by yours faithfully, God. Berkeley, Chaffee, following Knox, is sort of suggesting that, Berkeley is just sort of retreating into deism here, using God as this last-ditch effort to maintain some sort of certainty about the world. And that isn't really fair to Berkeley. And I have a little note here in my own text, version of the text, that says, no, see paragraph 6. And it always bothers me whenever textbook authors don't read the material in their own textbook. So if you go up here to paragraph 6, I'm just going to go ahead and increase the size of this really quickly here for this. You will see that Berkeley does not force anybody to believe in God. He doesn't, retreat to God using Chaffee, the author of a textbook phrase. What Berkeley says is that so long as they, and when he says they, the pronoun there is referring to any perception that you have, any idea that you have. So you have this perception of the mug. I have this perception of the mug. Now, of course, what happens to this mug whenever I'm not perceiving it. I just leave this mug in my office. So it's sitting here on my desk right now, and I'm looking at it, and you can see it, but I'm not going to adjust the camera, but it's still here. But you can't see it, but I can see it, right? So the the cup didn't just poof out of existence just because you can't see it, right? Esse est percipi. To be is to be perceived. It's not to be perceived by you. It's not to be perceived even by a human being. It's to be perceived at all. So even though you can't see the mug, I can still perceive the mug. But what happens at the end of the day? Whenever I exit the office, close the door, shut off the lights, does that mean that the mug and the contents more generally of my office just sort of poof out of existence? Well, that's one way. That's one possible conclusion, given the fact that all objects are perceptions, right? But Berkeley here says the following. He says, so long as they, these things that we perceive, so long as they are not actually perceived by me, or do not exist in my mind or that of any other created spirit, right? You're a created spirit. You can't perceive the cup that's on my desk. I, though, am another created spirit. I can perceive the cup that's on my desk. But again, what happens whenever I leave my office? What happens to the cup then? Berkeley tells us. He says, they must either, notice the word either there, they must either have no existence at all, which just means poof, no mug, or else subsist in the mind of some eternal spirit. Now, whenever Berkeley's talking about the eternal spirit, he's talking about God. So notice that Berkeley leaves it open to a hypothesis. Berkeley is not saying that you have to accept the existence of God. What Berkeley is going to say is, well, if it makes more sense to you to think that objects just poof out of existence altogether, then knock yourself out, right? Berkeley gives that hypothesis. He says there are those two possible options. And what Berkeley is going to say is, well, one of those options makes way more sense to me than the other one. But Berkeley is going to say, given what an object are, given objects are not material, right? I say that there is a mug, but I only say there's a mug because of the basis of my perceptions. And my perceptions aren't out in the world. My perceptions are internal, right? They are subjective. They're not objective. And so given that's what the nature of a thing is, then it's dependent upon perception. Esse est percipi. And given that it's subject to the act of perception, what happens to it when I'm not perceiving it, when you're not perceiving it, or what anybody else is perceiving it? Well, again, two possible options. One option, they poof out of existence. Or a second option is God acts as an eternal perceiver, and that's why the world continues to remain the same, even in certain circumstances when human beings aren't observing it, right? That's why you can have a banana on your countertop, leave for the weekend, where there's no human being in your house observing the banana, and then you come back from that weekend, and whenever you left, you had a yellow banana sitting on the counter, and when you come back, you have a black banana sitting on your counter. Now, how did that happen? Because you weren't there to perceive it, right? What we can say, sort of following Berkeley's suggestion here, is that, well, God is continually in the process of eternally viewing the entire contents of the universe, and that's what is responsible for the stasis and the relative stability of the world that you and I are perceiving, because we're ultimately just perceiving an extension of God's own mind. All right. Longer video than typical. I've been going on for about 25 or so minutes now, but even though the reading assignment for Berkeley was relatively brief, only about 5 or so pages, it's very dense. And so if you want more information, again, go to those external resources, those required external resources that are embedded in the lesson module. But for right now, I'm going to go ahead and let you go. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.